Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales. Before we journey into a raw and rugged story of a ghost who wouldn't die and the woman who wouldn't forget, do yourself a favor and subscribe to the channel. Make sure to ring that notification bell, because you won't want to miss a single legend from the unforgiving heart of the American West. Now, settle in and listen to the tale of Jedediah Kane and the woman with the hatchet who swore to send him back to the hell he cheated. The sun over Gallows Creek was a merciless, white-hot eye in a bleached blue sky. It baked the dust of the main street to a fine powder and beat down on the grim, silent crowd gathered around the town's newest and most prominent piece of architecture, a freshly built gallows. Its raw pine timbers still smelling of sap and finality. Atop this stage stood Jedediah Kane, the man of the hour. He was not a big man, but he possessed a coiled, serpentine energy that even the heavy iron shackles on his wrists and ankles couldn't entirely suppress. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, and the sea of face, some fearful, some hateful, some merely curious, and a slow, insolent grin spread across his lips. Jedediah Kane was a name that had been a plague upon the territory for a decade. He was a robber of banks, a rustler of cattle, a killer of men who stood in his way. He was not a man of mindless brutality, which made him all the more dangerous. He was intelligent, charming when he wanted to be, and possessed a survivor's instinct that was as sharp and as deadly as a honed blade. He had always been one step ahead of the law, a ghost on the plains. But his luck, like all things in the West, had finally run out. A betrayed safe house, a bloody shootout, and now, the scratch of a hemp rope against his neck. The territorial marshal, a big man with a walrus mustache and a weary expression, read the charges in a booming monotone. The litany of crimes: robbery, murder, treason against the peace of the territory was long enough to hang 10 men. Kane listened with the detached air of a man hearing a story about someone else. His life, a whirlwind of smoke, gunfire, and stolen gold, had come down to this. The nervous preacher offered him a final prayer, which Kane politely declined. "Save your words for the living, Padre," Kane rasped, his voice dry from dust and disuse. "They're the ones who'll need 'em. I've made my own arrangements." The hangman, a portly fellow sweating profusely in the heat, pulled a black hood over Kane's head, plunging him into a suffocating darkness. Kane took a deep breath, filling his lungs with what he believed was his last parcel of air. He thought, oddly, of nothing in particular. Not of the women he'd known, nor the gold he'd stolen. He simply felt a strange, quiet curiosity about what came next. The marshal gave the nod. The lever was pulled. The trapdoor sprung open with a deafening crack. Jedediah Kane dropped. The rope snapped taut. His neck did not. Instead of the instantaneous, neck-snapping jolt of a proper hanging, there was a gruesome, grinding, tearing sound. The rope, old and weathered, had been improperly stored. The sudden weight of a grown man dropping 10 feet was too much for the frayed hemp. It didn't break entirely, but it slipped, it stretched, it tore, strangling him, burning the flesh of his neck, but failing to do its one, simple job. He was left dangling, kicking, his body convulsing at the end of the rope, the black hood doing little to hide the horrific, choked gasps of a man being slowly and efficiently garroted. The crowd gasped in horror. The marshal cursed, drawing his pistol to put a merciful end to the botched execution. But in that moment of chaos, fate, or perhaps the devil himself, intervened once more. A volley of rifle fire erupted from the rooftops at the end of the street. Kane's gang, the last 3 loyal members of his notorious pack, had come to make a final, suicidal stand for their leader. Panic engulfed the square. The crowd scattered, screaming. The marshal and his deputies, caught by surprise, dove for cover, their attention torn from the man on the gallows. Bullets ripped through the air, chewing up the storefronts and kicking up plumes of dust. In the ensuing chaos, one of the gang's bullets, a stray shot of incredible luck, struck the main crossbeam of the gallows. The damaged wood groaned, splintered, and then, with a great crash, the entire structure collapsed, sending the half-dead Jedediah Kane tumbling to the ground amidst a ruin of fresh-cut timber. He landed hard, the impact knocking the last of the air from his lungs. He lay there, gasping, his vision swimming. He managed to rip the hood from his head. His neck was a raw, bloody mess, a horrific rope burn that would scar him for life. But he was alive. He could breathe. Through the dust and smoke, he saw one of his men, a young outlaw named Billy, get cut down by the marshal's return fire. His other two men were providing cover, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. This was not a rescue. It was a bloody farewell. Kane's survival instinct, the one that had kept him alive for so long, screamed back to life. He didn't wait. He didn't mourn. He scrambled to his feet, his shackled hands and feet making his movements clumsy. He spotted a horse, its reins trailing, its owner having fled in the panic. With a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, he hauled himself into the saddle. He dug his heels into the animal's flanks, and the terrified horse bolted, galloping out of Gallows Creek, leaving behind the dead, the dying, and the smoking ruin of Jedediah Kane's own execution. He rode into the wilderness, a dead man granted a second, undeserved life, the raw, burning brand of the rope around his neck a permanent reminder of the day he cheated the gallows. As the sounds of the gunfight faded behind him, he laughed, a choked sound. He was free. He truly believed his past was behind him, a collapsed pile of wood and a few dead men. He had no idea that his true reckoning had not been left on the gallows, but was waiting for him, somewhere out in the vast and forgiving silence of the West. 5 years before Jedediah Kane cheated the gallows, his name was a curse whispered in the quiet, fertile Willow Creek Valley. The valley was a small pocket of paradise, a place where the hard work of homesteaders had coaxed a green and gentle life from the wild land. It was here that the Caldwell family had built their world. There was the father, a stern but fair man with hands as tough as old leather, the two sons, strong and full of the easy laughter of youth, and there was Lena, the daughter, a young woman of 16 with eyes the color of the summer sky and a spirit as bright and as untamed as a wild Mustang. Their life was one of hard work, simple faith, and the deep, abiding love of a family bound to the land. That life was burned to the ground in a single afternoon of senseless violence. Jedediah Kane and his gang descended on the valley not for money. Homesteaders had little but for horses and supplies, and as a brutal message to the territory that no place was beyond their reach. The Caldwells, stubborn and proud, refused to be intimidated. They fought back. It was a valiant, but hopeless, stand. Lena had been hidden in the root cellar by her father, the heavy wooden doors thrown over her, his last words a command to stay silent, no matter what she heard. And so, she listened. She listened to the roar of gunshots, the splintering of wood, the triumphant, cruel whoops of the outlaws. And then, the worst sound of all, the voice of her father, crying out in a pain that was cut short. Then, silence. A silence that was heavier, more final, than any sound. She waited in the suffocating darkness for what felt like an eternity, her own screams trapped in her throat. When she finally pushed open the doors and crawled out, it was into a scene from hell. Her home was an inferno, the flames devouring the life she had known. Her father and her two brothers lay in the dust, their bodies still, their lives stolen for a few horses and a sack of flour. And standing over them, his face illuminated by the fire, was Jedediah Kane. He was wiping his pistol clean on a rag, his expression not of triumph or remorse, but of simple, detached indifference. He was a businessman finishing a transaction. Their eyes met for a fleeting second across the flames. He saw a terrified girl crawling from a hole in the ground. She saw the devil. He turned, mounted his horse, and rode away with his men, leaving her alone in the ruins. Lena Caldwell died that day. The girl of 16 with the bright spirit was consumed by the same fire that took her home. What crawled out of the ashes was something else, something harder, colder, and animated by a single, burning purpose. She was found 3 days later by a grizzled, solitary mountain man named Elias, who had seen the smoke and come down from the high country to investigate. He found a half-starved, catatonic girl sitting amidst the ruins, clutching a small, wood-handled hatchet, her father's kindling axe, the only thing she had managed to salvage. Elias took her in, not out of pity, but out of a grim recognition. He saw in her haunted, empty eyes a reflection of a darkness he had once known in himself. For the first year, she barely spoke. She was a ghost, performing the chores of survival by rote. But beneath the silent, placid surface, a fire was being banked. She spent her days in the woods, the hatchet in her hand. At first, she just chopped wood, the rhythmic, percussive impacts a balm for her shattered soul. But slowly, the chopping changed. It became practice. She began to throw it, aiming at trees, her frustration and grief fueling her efforts. The heavy, clumsy tool became an extension of her arm. It became a part of her. Elias watched her transformation with a sad, knowing silence. He had been a lawman once, then a bounty hunter, and he knew the corrosive nature of vengeance. He tried to steer her away from it. "Hate's a fire that consumes the house it's kept in, girl," he told her one evening. "My house has already been burned to the ground," she replied, her voice flat, her eyes never leaving the hatchet she was sharpening on a whetstone. "Now, all I have is the fire." Seeing he could not dissuade her, he decided to arm her. If she was going to walk the path of the hunter, he would make damn sure she was the most dangerous predator in the wilderness. He took her training seriously. He was a harsh and forgiving teacher. He taught her to track, to read the land, to move in silence. He taught her the art of the ambush, of using the environment to her advantage. And he honed her skill with the hatchet until it was a terrifying thing to behold. She learned to throw it with pinpoint accuracy, to make it spin and strike with a deadly thud from 50 feet away. She learned to wield it in close-quarters combat, not as a clumsy axe in wide, sweeping arcs, but as a fluid, deadly instrument, a blur of motion that could block, parry, and strike. It was an unconventional weapon, a brutal, intimate tool of vengeance that required her to be close to her enemy, to see the fear in their eyes. And that was exactly what she wanted. She did not forget a single detail of that day. She knew the names of Kane's 3 lieutenants who had been with him. She studied their habits, their weaknesses, learning everything she could from the whispers and rumors that floated up into the mountains. And she studied Kane himself. She learned of his arrogance, his love of poker, his preference for a certain brand of whiskey. She built a portrait of him in her mind, a map of his soul that she would one day use to destroy him. Then came the news, delivered by a traveling fur trapper. Jedediah Kane had been captured. He was to be hanged in a town called Gallows Creek. For a moment, Lena felt a surge of something she couldn't identify. Relief. Disappointment. She had been cheated of her chance. The law had stolen her vengeance. A week later, the trapper returned, his eyes wide with a tale that was already becoming a legend. The botched hanging. The escape. Kane was alive. He had cheated death. Lena felt no despair. Instead, a cold, serene calm settled over her. It was not the law's place to judge Jedediah Kane. It was hers. Fate had not cheated her. It had given her a gift. It had returned her monster to the world, and now she was ready to hunt him. She was no longer a victim. She was no longer a girl. She was the living memory of the Caldwell family, and her name was a debt that Jedediah Kane was, one day soon, going to have to pay in full. Jedediah Kane, reborn with a rope-scarred neck and a renewed sense of invincibility, spent a year drifting. He laid low, letting the legend of his miraculous escape curdle into myth. The territory was too hot, the price on his head too high. He worked his way down to the Mexican border, a ghost in a land of ghosts, taking odd jobs on ranches, winning money in backroom poker games, and generally keeping his head down. But a man like Kane could not stay quiet for long. The thrill of the outlaw life, the easy money, the power, it was a drug he couldn't quit. And his arrogance, fed by the belief that he was a man who couldn't be killed, was a dangerous poison. He decided it was time to get his old life back. He sent out word through the underworld's grapevine, calling his scattered flock. The first to answer was Smiling Jack, a handsome, sociopathic killer who had been with him that day in Willow Creek Valley. The rendezvous point was a town called Prospector's Hope, a dusty, fly-blown settlement that had sprung up around a played-out silver mine. It was a place for forgotten men and broken dreams, a perfect place for a ghost to begin his resurrection. Kane rode into Prospector's Hope feeling like a king returning to his kingdom. The jagged, purple scar around his neck, a mark of his near death, he now wore like a crown. It gave him an aura of the supernatural, and men in the saloons gave him a wide berth, whispering his name in a mixture of fear and awe. He was enjoying the infamy, soaking it in. He did not know that his every move was being watched. Lena Caldwell had been in Prospector's Hope for 2 months. She was no longer the wild girl of the mountains. She was a ghost of a different sort. She worked as a mender in the back of the town's general store, a quiet, almost invisible woman with downcast eyes and nimble fingers. She was Eliza, a widow from the east who had lost her husband to cholera. She spoke little, kept to herself, and faded into the town's drab background. No one gave her a second glance. And all the while, she was listening, waiting, her patience a cold spring. When she heard the whispers that Jedediah Kane was coming to town, she felt not a surge of adrenaline, but the quiet, grim satisfaction of a hunter whose prey was finally walking into the trap. She saw him the moment he rode in. She was sweeping the boardwalk in front of the store, and she looked up from beneath the brim of her bonnet. Her heart did not pound. It went cold and still. He looked older, harder, and the scar on his neck was a brutal, physical manifestation of his evil. But it was him. The face from her nightmares was real, and it was here. She quickly lowered her head, her knuckles white on the broom handle, and forced herself to remain calm. That night, Kane and Smiling Jack took over a poker table in the town's busiest saloon, The Last Chance. Kane was in his element, a bottle of whiskey at his elbow, a pile of chips in front of him, the fear and respect of the other players fueling his ego. He was laughing, telling a story about a bank job, his voice the same confident, charming baritone she remembered from the day her world ended. Lena entered the saloon. It was a place a respectable woman like Eliza would never go, but she didn't care. She was on the hunt. She carried a basket of laundry, a prop, an excuse for her presence. She moved through the smoky, noisy room, keeping to the shadows along the wall, her eyes locked on the poker table. She watched him for a full hour. She studied the way he held his cards, the way he drank his whiskey, the way his eyes would flicker on the room, a predator's constant, casual assessment of his surroundings. She was etching every detail, every mannerism, into her memory. She was learning the rhythm of her enemy's heart. Then, Kane looked up from his cards, his gaze sweeping the room. His eyes passed over her, then flicked back, a flicker of something that recognition, but a primal sense of being watched making him pause. He looked directly at her. In that instant, Lena let the mask of the meek widow fall away. She did not smile. She did not scowl. She simply met his gaze, and for a single, charged second, she let him see the truth in her eyes. She let him see the cold, bottomless, and forgiving hatred that had been her only companion for 5 years. She let him see the ghost of Willow Creek Valley. Kane's smile faltered. He didn't know who she was. The terrified, soot-stained girl from the cellar was a distant, an important memory. But he saw the look in her eyes, and it was a look he understood. It was the look of a loaded gun. It was a promise. A cold chill, a feeling he hadn't experienced since the rope had tightened around his neck, snaked its way down his spine. Who was this woman? And why did she look at him as if she were staring at a dead man? Smiling Jack, oblivious, laughed at something another player said. The moment was broken. Lena lowered her gaze, turned, and walked out of the saloon, melting back into the night, her basket of laundry still on her arm. She had accomplished her mission. She had announced her presence. She had planted a seed of doubt and fear in the mind of the man who believed he could not be rattled. Jedediah Kane stared at the empty doorway, the cards in his hand forgotten. The saloon was still loud, the whiskey still strong, but the taste of victory in his mouth had turned to ash. He didn't know her name, but he knew her face would haunt him. The game had changed. He was no longer just rebuilding his empire. He was now being hunted, and for the first time in a very long time, Jedediah Kane felt the cold, unfamiliar touch of fear. The silent, burning gaze Lena had fixed on Jedediah Kane in the saloon was a declaration of war, and Kane was a man who understood such declarations. The unease she had planted in his soul grew into a gnawing paranoia. He didn't know who she was, but he knew she was a threat. He and Smiling Jack left Prospector's Hope the next morning, not in a rush, but with a new, wary tension in their movements. Kane told Jack to keep an eye out for a quiet woman with haunted eyes, but he couldn't provide a name or a reason, which only earned him a quizzical look from his lieutenant. Kane was heading for a prearranged rendezvous deep in the Badlands, a place called Serpent's Tooth Canyon, where the last two members of his original gang, a hulking brute named Silas and a shifty knife fighter called Pete, were waiting for him. It was to be the rebirth of the Kane gang. Lena was already gone. She had slipped out of town hours before dawn, not following Kane's trail directly, but taking the high paths, the forgotten trails Elias had taught her. She was not a pursuer, she was a predator, circling her prey, using her knowledge of the land to get ahead of them. She knew the territory better than they did. She knew where they were going. An outlaw gang, even one as cunning as Kane's, was a creature of habit. They would seek out defensible, isolated locations with access to water. Serpent's Tooth Canyon was the most logical choice. She would be there waiting for them. The journey was a transformation. The meek, invisible Eliza was shed like a skin, and Lena, the hunter, emerged. She moved through the rugged, sun-baked landscape with a silent, fluid grace, her father's hatchet now strapped to her hip, its worn hickory handle a familiar, comforting weight. The land was her ally, the rocks and shadows her accomplices. She arrived at the canyon a full day before Kane and Smiling Jack. She scouted the area, her eyes missing nothing. The canyon was a natural fortress, with a single, narrow entrance and high, sheer walls. But every fortress has a weakness. She found a goat trail, a treacherous, barely their path that led to the top of the canyon rim. From there, she could look down upon the entire canyon floor, where a small, clear spring trickled from the rock's very spot where the outlaws would make their camp. She watched as Silas and Pete arrived, two hard men, their faces familiar to her from the day of the massacre. The sight of them did not stir a storm of rage in her, but a cold, deadly calm. They were just pieces on the board, obstacles to be removed before she could get to the king. When Kane and Smiling Jack rode in the next day, the gang was reunited. For a few hours, the canyon was filled with their loud, boisterous reunion. They passed a bottle of whiskey, their laughter echoing off the rock walls, confident in the security of their remote stronghold. They were four of the most dangerous men in the territory, together again. They felt invincible. Lena watched from above, a patient, silent specter. She waited until night fell, until the fire had burned down to a bed of glowing embers and the whiskey had made them careless. She waited until the man on watch, Pete, was starting to nod off, his head slumped against a rock. She moved then, not down the goat trail, but along the canyon rim to a spot directly above their camp. Her first target was not a man, but their sense of security. She had gathered a pile of small, loose rocks. She began to drop them, one by one, into the darkness on the far side of the camp. The sound of each pebble skittering down the rock face was a small, sharp, and natural noise in the immense silence of the desert night. Pete, the man on watch, jerked awake. "Who's there?" he hissed into the darkness. The others stirred. "Just a coyote, Pete," Silas grumbled from his bedroll. But the sounds continued, random, intermittent, just enough to put them on edge. Lena was playing with them, a cat with fur-cornered mice. She was turning their fortress into a cage. Her first real attack was aimed at Pete. As he stood up and peered into the darkness, his back to the canyon wall, Lena took aim. The hatchet left her hand a silent, spinning blur of dark steel. It flew through the night air and buried itself in the wooden stock of the rifle Pete was holding. The impact was so powerful it ripped the gun from his hands and sent a painful shock up his arms. He cried out in shock and pain, stumbling back, staring at the hatchet quivering in his ruined rifle, a mere inch from where his hand had been. Chaos erupted. The three other men scrambled for their guns, firing blindly into the darkness. "It's an ambush," Smiling Jack yelled. "Who is it?" Kane roared, taking cover behind a large boulder, his eyes scanning the impenetrable darkness of the canyon walls. "The Law, a rival gang." But there was no return fire, only silence, and the chilling, undeniable evidence of the hatchet. It was not the weapon of the Law. It was something else, something personal. Lena had already moved, scrambling back along the rim. Her goal had been accomplished. She had wounded one, terrified them all, and left her calling card. She wanted them to spend the night in fear, their confidence shattered, wondering what kind of demon was hunting them from the darkness. The next day, the outlaws were a wreck. They were jumpy, irritable, arguing amongst themselves. They knew they couldn't stay in the canyon. They were trapped. They decided to ride out at first light. But Lena was waiting for them at the canyon's narrow entrance. She had spent the last hours of the night preparing an ambush, not with guns, but with the land itself. Using a downed log and a pile of heavy rocks, she had created a deadfall trap, balanced precariously on a ledge above the trail, held in place by a single, taut rope. As the four riders entered the narrow passage, their eyes nervously scanning the cliffs, Lena, hidden in a crevice, pulled the rope. With a deafening groan, the deadfall gave way. The massive log and a ton of rock and earth crashed down onto the trail. It didn't hit any of them, but it completely blocked the path in front of them, trapping them in the narrow passage. Their horses, terrified, reared and screamed. From a position high above and behind them, Lena opened fire with a rifle Elias had given her. She was not aiming to kill, not yet. She fired at the rock walls around them, sending chips of stone and shrieking ricochets echoing through the passage. It was pure psychological warfare. "It's her," Kane roared, finally understanding. It was the woman from the saloon. He didn't know how, he didn't know why, but it was her. Silas, the hulking brute, made a foolish mistake. Driven by rage, he spurred his horse, trying to charge back the way they had come. As he passed her position, Lena stood, and the hatchet flew from her hand. This time, it was not a warning. It spun through the air with a deadly grace and buried itself deep in Silas's broad back. He let out a choked cry and toppled from his saddle, dead before he hit the ground. Smiling Jack and Pete, seeing this, panicked. They abandoned their horses and scrambled up the rocky walls of the passage, firing wildly as they fled. Kane, ever the survivor, did the same, but he moved with a cold, calculated precision, using the terrain for cover. Lena let them go. She had accomplished her mission. She had killed one, rooted the others, and shattered the newly reborn Kane gang before it could even begin. She retrieved her hatchet from the body of the dead outlaw, her face an impassive mask. She looked in the direction the three survivors had fled. The hunt was far from over, but the message had been delivered in the clearest possible terms. She was not just a ghost at a poker table. She was a whisper of the hatchet in the wind, a relentless, inescapable force of retribution. And she was coming for all of them. The aftermath of the ambush at Serpent's Tooth Canyon was a turning point. For Jedediah Kane, it was a brutal awakening. His dream of a triumphant return, of rebuilding his legend, had been shattered by a single, determined woman with a hatchet. He had lost a man, lost his horses, and, most importantly, he had lost the aura of invincibility that had been his armor. As he, smiling Jack, and the now terrified Pete made their desperate, on-foot retreat through the barren wilderness, the specter of the woman haunted him. Who was she? What did she want? The lack of answers was a special kind of torture for a man who prided himself on control and information. The rope burn on his neck, his mark of survival, now felt less like a trophy and more like a brand, a mark that made him visible to the demons of his past. The fear he had felt in the saloon was now a constant, cold companion. For Lena, the victory was a grim, hollow thing. She stood over the body of Silas, the second of her family's murderers to fall, and felt no triumph. The brief, hot flash of satisfaction as her hatchet found its mark had been replaced by a chilling, profound emptiness. She had taken a life, deliberately and with brutal efficiency. The act, she realized, had not lessened her grief. It had only added a new, heavy weight to her soul. As she cleaned the blade of her hatchet in the sand, she looked at her own reflection in the polished steel. The face that stared back was a stranger's, the eyes as hard and as cold as the weapon she held. The line between justice and simple, brutal revenge was becoming blurred, and the realization was a disquieting tremor in the foundation of her quest. She was now faced with a choice. The remaining outlaws were scattered, on foot, and vulnerable. She could press her advantage, hunt them down like the wounded animals they were. The hunter in her, the part of her forged by Elias in the mountains, urged her to do just that. But another part, a small, weary echo of the girl from Willow Creek Valley, hesitated. Each act of violence was chipping away at her own humanity, leaving something colder and more ruthless in its place. Was this what her father and brothers would have wanted? For her to become a monster in their name? This internal conflict manifested in her dreams. The nightmares of the fire and her family's death were now intertwined with new, more disturbing images. She dreamt of the men she had killed, of Silas's face as he fell, of the weight of the hatchet in her hand. She would wake up under a cold blanket of stars, her own hands trembling, the line between the avenger and the killer becoming harder and harder to see. Meanwhile, Kane and his two remaining men were fighting for their own survival. The desert was a harsh and unforgiving enemy. They were low on water, their nerves frayed to the breaking point. The shifty Pete, his courage gone, was the first to break. "This is a curse," he babbled one night as they huddled behind a rock, starting at every sound. "That ain't no woman, Jed. That's a spirit. She's come for us for what we did at that farm, the Caldwell place." The name hit Kane like a physical blow. The Caldwell place. Willow Creek Valley. He remembered it now. The stubborn farmer, the two boys who fought like cornered cats, and the girl. The soot-stained girl crawling out of the root cellar. The girl with the sky-blue eyes filled with a horror so profound it had, for a moment, given even him pause. He remembered their eyes meeting across the flames. And with a sickening, dawning horror, he realized that the eyes of the ghost in the saloon, the eyes of the hunter in the canyon, were the same eyes. "Lena," he breathed, the name a strange and bitter taste in his mouth. Lena Caldwell. The mystery was solved, but the truth was 100 times more terrifying than any supernatural explanation. This wasn't a rival gang or a random bounty hunter. This was a ghost of his own making, a debt he had never bothered to count, come back to be collected. His casual, thoughtless act of brutality 5 years ago had not ended a family line, it had forged a nemesis. The revelation broke what little was left of Pete's nerve. In the middle of the night, he stole the last of their water and fled, trying to save his own skin. His flight was a foolish, desperate act. Lena, who had been shadowing them, found him the next day, delirious from heat and thirst, crawling in the sand. She stood over him, a silent, dark angel of death. He looked up at her, his cracked lips moving, but no sound coming out. He was a pathetic, broken thing. Killing him now would be an act of mercy, not vengeance. The internal struggle she had been feeling came to a head. Was this justice? To kill a man who was already dying, who was already defeated by his own cowardice and the harshness of the land. She remembered Elias's words, "Hate's a fire that consumes the house it's kept in." She looked at Pete, and she saw not a monster, but a man consumed. Her hatred was a clean, sharp thing. His fear was a ragged, pathetic one. She made a choice. She unslung her canteen and poured a small amount of water onto the sand near his head. It was not enough to save him, but it was a gesture. "Kane knows who I am," she said, her voice flat. "Tell him I'm not a spirit. I'm a promise he made to my family, and I'm coming to see it kept." She turned and walked away, leaving him to his fate. It was a crueler act, in some ways, than a quick death. She left him with the knowledge that his leader knew what was coming, and that she was not an indiscriminate killer, but a focused, personal instrument of their own past. Kane and Smiling Jack, tracking Pete, found him a few hours later. He was barely alive, but he managed to deliver Lena's message before he died. The news that she had let him live, that she had spoken to him, was more terrifying to Kane than if she had simply killed him. This wasn't a blood-crazed killer. This was someone with a purpose, someone with a code. And her message was clear. She wasn't just killing them. She was dismantling them, body and soul. "So," Smiling Jack said, his usual smirk gone, replaced by a grim tightness. "The farmer's daughter. Who'd have thought? I should have killed her when I had the chance," Kane said, his voice a low growl. The weight of his past sins was, for the first time, becoming a heavy, tangible thing. He was not just an outlaw fighting for survival. He was a man being haunted by the consequences of his own casual evil. The fear was now mixed with something else, something he had never felt before, a flicker of dread that felt almost like guilt. The death of Pete and Lena's chilling message solidified the conflict into a raw, personal duel. Jedediah Kane and Smiling Jack were all that was left of the gang, two cornered wolves against a relentless hunter. Their flight took them north, into the skeletal, windswept plains of the high country. They needed a place to rest, to rearm, to make a stand. Their destination was a place as broken and haunted as they were, the ghost town of Serenity Flats, a settlement that had died of thirst when its only well went dry a decade earlier. It was a skeleton of a town, its buildings bleached gray by the sun, its streets home only to the wind and the dust devils. It was a perfect place for a final confrontation. He was a survivor, and his fear was slowly being replaced by a cold, calculating anger. He was done running. He knew Lena would come for them, and this time, he would be ready. The ghost town was a maze of cover and concealment, a tactical playground. He was a master of the gunfight, of using the environment to his advantage. He would turn her own tactics against her. He would lure her into a trap and end this once and for all. Lena knew where he was going. She knew Kane's mind now. He wouldn't run forever. His pride wouldn't allow it. A ghost town was a logical choice, a place where a final, bloody act could be played out in private. She did not follow them in. She circled the town for a full day, like a hawk, observing from the surrounding hills. She watched them fortify their position, turning the old, two-story saloon at the center of town into a makeshift fortress. She saw the glint of their rifle barrels in the windows. They were expecting her. They were waiting. The confrontation began not with a bang, but with a whisper. As dusk settled, casting long, distorted shadows across the empty street, Lena made her first move. She used the gathering darkness to slip into the town, not towards the saloon, but into the old blacksmith shop at the far end of the street. Inside, amidst the rusted tools and the cold forge, she found what she was looking for, a heavy anvil and a length of chain. She waited until the moon was high, casting a pale, ghostly light over the dead town. Then, she began to strike the anvil with a heavy hammer. Clang, clang, clang. The sound, a slow, rhythmic, funereal toll, echoed through the silent streets. It was the sound of a coffin nail being driven home. Inside the saloon, Kane and Jack were startled by the sound. "What in the hell is that?" Jack whispered, peering out the window. "It's her," Kane said, his knuckles white on his rifle stock. "She's playing with us." The tolling continued for 10 agonizing minutes, a nerve-shredding symphony that frayed their already raw nerves. Then, it stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. Lena used that silence to move. She slipped from the blacksmith's and circled around to the back of the saloon. She knew she couldn't breach their fortress directly. She had to draw them out. Her attack was a feint. She threw a rock through a side window of the general store across the street from the saloon. The sound of shattering glass made Kane and Jack open fire on the store, their rifle blasts a deafening roar in the night. They peppered the empty building with lead, wasting ammunition, their fear making them reckless. While they were distracted, Lena was at the back of the saloon. The building was old, its timbers dry as bone. She had a flask of oil. She poured it against the rear wall, then lit a piece of cloth and tossed it onto the oil-soaked wood. The fire took hold with a hungry whoosh. The first they knew of the new threat was the smell of smoke. "Fire!" Jack yelled, his voice cracking with panic. The back of their fortress was burning. They were faced with a terrible choice: stay inside and burn, or run out into the open street where she was waiting for them. Kane made the decision. "Out the front," he roared. "We make a run for the livery stable." They burst out of the swinging doors of the saloon, guns blazing, firing wildly into the shadows of the main street. Lena was not there. She was waiting, not in the street, but on the roof of the assayer's office next door, a position she had taken while they were focused on the general store. From her vantage point, she had a clear field of fire. As the two men sprinted across the dusty street, silhouetted against the growing flames of their burning fortress, she took aim. Her first target was smiling Jack. He was handsome, vain, and his death needed to be a reflection of his life. Her rifle cracked. The bullet took him not in the chest, but in the leg, shattering his knee. He went down with a high-pitched scream, his handsome face contorted in agony. Kane didn't stop. He didn't even look back. He was a survivor, and his only instinct was self-preservation. He dove behind the stone wall of an old well in the center of the street, rolling into cover as Lena's second shot kicked up dust where he had been. The duet had begun. It was now just the two of them, separated by 30 yards of moonlit, dusty street. Kane, pinned behind the well, and Lena, a phantom on the rooftop. "Caldwell," Kane yelled, his voice a raw snarl. "You want me? Come and get me." "I'm not in a hurry, Jedediah." Her voice drifted back, seemingly coming from the shadows themselves. "I have all night." What followed was a deadly chess match. Kane, a master of gunfighting, would try to draw her fire, to pinpoint her location. He would hold up his hat on a stick, only to have it shot from his hand with contemptuous ease. Lena, a master of the hunt, would shift her position, moving silently across the connected rooftops, making it impossible for him to know where the next shot would come from. The night wore on. The saloon burned down to a pile of glowing embers. Smiling Jack lay moaning in the street, His pleas for help from Cain met with a cold, pragmatic silence. The moon began its slow descent. The duel of the ghost town was a stalemate, a tense, breathless pause before the final, bloody crescendo that they both knew would come with the dawn. The long, cold hours of the night had stripped the conflict down to its rawest elements. The burning saloon had dwindled to a malevolent bed of glowing coals, casting a faint, hellish light on the silent street. Smiling Jack's moans had faded into a weak, intermittent whimpering. The ghost town of Serenity Flats held its breath, waiting. It was a duel of patience and will between two apex predators, each waiting for the other to make a mistake. Jedediah Cain, trapped behind the low stone wall of the well, and Lena Caldwell, a phantom of the rooftops, were locked in a deadly, silent conversation. Cain knew he was at a disadvantage. Lena had the high ground, the better position, but he had a lifetime of experience in surviving impossible situations. He was not just a gunslinger, he was a student of human nature. He knew his opponent was driven by a personal, burning hatred, and he decided to use that hatred as a weapon against her. "You know, I remember him," Cain called out into the darkness, his voice taking on a conversational, almost mocking tone. "Your father. He was a stubborn old goat, died with a pitchfork in his hands. He had guts, I'll give him that." Lena did not reply. She remained silent, motionless, refusing to take the bait. "The boys too," Cain continued, his voice dripping with a false sincerity. "They fought hard. For a couple of farm kids. It was a shame, really. All that wasted effort. All they had to do was give us the horses." He was trying to make her angry, to make her reckless, to make her show herself. He paused, listening to the silence. "But you were the smart one, hiding in your hole in the ground. I saw you, you know. Just a scared little rabbit. I almost sent Jack down to finish the job. My one mistake, I suppose. Forgetting about the rabbit." That last remark, the casual, dismissive way he spoke of the moment that had defined her entire existence, was the one that finally found a crack in her icy control. A hot, white flash of pure rage surged through her. Her hands tightened on her rifle. She had to fight the overwhelming urge to stand and empty the weapon in his direction. And in that moment of internal struggle, she made a tiny, almost imperceptible sound scuff of her boot on the roof's wooden shingles as she shifted her weight. It was all Cain needed. He had been listening not for a voice, but for a sound, any sound. The scuff pinpointed her position. He didn't fire at her. He fired at the rusted, iron bell that hung in the dilapidated church steeple at the end of the street, behind her position. He was an exceptional marksman. The bullet struck the bell with a loud, jarring clang. The sudden, unexpected sound, coming from behind her, was a disorienting shock. For a split second, her survival instincts made her flinch, to turn toward the new and known threat. And in that split second, Cain moved. He burst from behind the well, not running for new cover, but running directly at her, closing the distance, his revolver roaring in his hand. He was turning the tables, transforming a sniper's duel into a close-quarters brawl. Bullets tore through the rooftop where she had been, a storm of lead that would have killed her had she not reacted. But Lena's training with Elias had been about more than just patience, it had been about instinct. As Cain charged, she didn't try to aim her rifle. She dropped it, throwing herself flat and rolling away from the incoming fire. She came up in a crouch, her father's hatchet now in her hand. Cain was on the street below, reloading, a grim, triumphant smile on his face. He thought he had her. But Lena was no longer on the roof. She ran to the edge and, without hesitation, leaped. She landed hard on the narrow wooden awning of the general store below, the impact jarring her to the bone. From there, she dropped to the street, landing in a cloud of dust, not 20 feet from him. The hunter had come down from her perch. The duel was now on even ground. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the eastern sky in shades of blood red and bruised purple. The first rays of dawn cut through the dusty air, illuminating the two combatants in the empty street. It was a scene from a dime novel, but the stakes were terrifyingly real. "No more hiding, Rabbit," Cain snarled, raising his reloaded pistol. "No more lies, Snake," Lena retorted, the hatchet held low and ready in her hand. What followed was a deadly dance. Cain was a master of the gun, firing with a cold precision. Lena was a master of movement, a whirlwind of motion. She never stood still, never gave him a clean target. She weaved and dodged, using the derelict wagons and water troughs for intermittent cover, the hatchet not a throwing weapon now, but a shield, its polished head deflecting a bullet in a shower of sparks, a move of pure, desperate instinct that made even Kane's eyes widen in disbelief. She was closing the distance. That was her only advantage. His gun was useless if she could get close enough. He knew it. He backed away, still firing, trying to keep her at bay. The final, desperate moments of the battle played out in a chaotic, swirling crossfire in the center of the dead town. The roars of Kane's revolver and the high-pitched shriek of Lena's deflected shots echoed off the silent, watching buildings. It was a clash of two worlds, the cold, detached violence of the firearm against the raw, intimate brutality of the blade. The reckoning at sunrise had finally arrived. The rising sun turned the dust of Serenity Flats into a swirling, golden haze. The duel had devolved into a desperate, close-quarters battle of attrition. Jedediah Kane, backing away, firing, was a cornered animal using its deadliest weapon. Lena, advancing, weaving, her hatchet a gleaming extension of her will, was the embodiment of relentless, inescapable consequence. Kane was down to his last two shots. He had underestimated her speed, her agility, her sheer, ferocious refusal to die. He had expected a farm girl playing at revenge. He had found a warrior. He stopped backpedaling and planted his feet, a cold, final resolve in his eyes. No more running. He would end this here, with his last two bullets. He took careful aim, not at her body, but at her head, a shot to end it all. Lena saw the shift in his posture, the sudden stillness that signaled a kill shot. She threw the hatchet. It was not an act of desperation, but a calculated, tactical move. She didn't throw it at him. She threw it at the ground just in front of him. The hatchet spun, and its heavy, steel head struck a large, flat rock embedded in the street. The impact sent the hatchet spinning wildly up into the air and showered Kane's face with a spray of sharp rock fragments and dust. He cried out, an involuntary reaction, his eyes squeezed shut against the sudden, blinding pain. His carefully aimed shot went wide, roaring harmlessly into the sky. In that single, blinded moment, Lena closed the final distance. She crashed into him with the force of a locomotive, a whirlwind of focused fury. The gun went flying from his hand as they tumbled to the ground in a tangle of limbs. The fight was now primal. It was fists and feet, teeth and nails. Kane, for all his skill with a gun, was a brawler. He was strong, his hands like iron. He fought with a dirty, street-smart brutality. But Lena was fighting with the strength of 5 years of hate, of a grief so profound it had become a physical force. She was tireless, relentless. She managed to get her hands on the hatchet, which had fallen nearby. Kane saw it, and his eyes went wide with terror. He grabbed her wrist, his fingers digging into her flesh, trying to stop the blade from coming down. They were locked in a desperate, straining stalemate, their faces inches apart, their ragged breaths mingling in the cool morning air. "This is for my father," Lena grunted, words torn from her as she put all of her strength, all of her soul, into that one arm. He was a fool, Kane snarled, his face a mask of sweat and blood, his grip slipping. "This is for my brothers," she screamed, a sound of pure, heartbreaking anguish. The memory of their faces gave her a fresh surge of strength. The hatchet moved, inch by agonizing inch. Kane knew he was losing. In a final, desperate act, he released her wrist and, with his free hand, reached for the knife sheathed in his boot. He was fast. He brought the blade up in a vicious, sweeping arc. Lena saw the glint of steel. She couldn't stop the hatchet's downward momentum, and she couldn't dodge the knife. In a split second, a choice was made. A price was paid. She twisted her body, taking the full force of the knife's upward thrust deep into her left shoulder. A cry of pure, white-hot agony was ripped from her lips. But her own blow did not falter. The hatchet, fueled by the last of her strength and all of her pain, completed its journey. It struck Jedediah Kane not in the head, a death too quick, but in the chest, with a sickening, final thud. For a moment, there was a stunned, terrible silence. Kane's eyes were wide with a final, ultimate surprise. He looked down at the blade buried in his chest, then up at her face. He opened his mouth, but only a bloody gurgle escaped. The life, the arrogance, the evil, all drained out of him, leaving only a husk. He collapsed, his body going limp, his dead weight pinning her to the ground. Lena lay there, trapped beneath the body of her nemesis, the man who had haunted her every waking moment. The knife in her shoulder was a source of excruciating, throbbing pain. The world was beginning to swim, to go gray at the edges. She had done it. She had completed her quest. The monster was dead. With a final, monumental effort, she pushed his body off her. She staggered to her feet, swaying, her left arm hanging useless and bloody at her side. She looked down at Kane's body, at the peaceful, almost serene expression the dead sometimes wear. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction. The great, roaring fire of her vengeance had burned itself out, and all that was left was the pain, the exhaustion, and the terrible, echoing silence in her soul. She stumbled over to where smiling Jack lay. He was still alive, barely, his eyes wide with terror. He had witnessed the entire, brutal finale. He looked at her, at the bloody knife handle protruding from her shoulder, and he began to sob, a pathetic, broken sound. Lena looked at him, not with hatred, but with a profound and utter weariness. The cycle of killing felt, in that moment, like a disease. She turned her back on him and began to walk, a slow, staggering, painful journey, out of the ghost town, leaving the dead and the dying behind her. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she had to keep moving, to walk away from the ghosts of Serenity Flats, and, perhaps, from the ghosts she herself had become. The reckoning was over. The price had been an eye for an eye, a wound for a wound, and it had left them all blind and broken in the dust. The sun was high and hot by the time Lena cleared the last of the derelict buildings of Serenity Flats. Each step was a battle against the waves of pain radiating from the knife buried in her shoulder. The world had a shimmering, unreal quality, and the only thing that kept her moving forward was a stubborn, primal instinct to survive. The fire of vengeance was gone, and in its place was a flickering, fragile ember of a will to live. She knew she wouldn't get far on foot. Blood was soaking the sleeve of her shirt, a steady, warm drip that marked her passage in the dust. She needed a horse. She needed help. Her mind, foggy with pain, latched onto a single name: Elias. The mountain man. His cabin was 100 miles away, an impossible distance, but it was the only direction, the only sanctuary her mind could conjure. She found the Outlaws' horses tethered in the dilapidated livery stable where Kane and Jack had left them. The animals were skittish, their eyes wide from the sounds of the gunfight. She approached Kane's horse, a powerful black gelding. The horse, sensing the smell of blood and death on her, shied away. She spoke to it in a low, soothing tone, the same way her father had taught her to gentle wild things. Finally, it allowed her to approach. Mounting was an exercise in pure agony. The movement sent a bolt of lightning through her shoulder, and she nearly blacked out. But she managed to haul herself into the saddle. She slumped forward, her good hand clutching the saddle horn, and let the horse pick its way out of the town, away from the dead. The journey was a fever dream. The vast, indifferent landscape of the west blurred into a shifting panorama of rock and sky. She rode for hours, drifting in and out of consciousness. The pain in her shoulder was a constant, throbbing presence, a brutal reminder of the price of her victory. During her lucid moments, the full weight of what she had done settled upon her. She had killed for men. She had become the thing she had set out to destroy, a person who solved their problems with violence, who left a trail of bodies in their wake. The ghosts of her past were joined by new ones. The face of Jedediah Kane, his eyes wide with that final, ultimate surprise, was seared into her memory. She had sought justice, but what she had delivered felt like something uglier, something that had stained her as much as it had punished him. By the second day, the fever had set in. Her wound was infected, angry, swollen mass. She was delirious, her mind a swirl of disconnected images, her father's smile, the fire, the glint of Elias's whetstone, the taste of dust and blood in Serenity Flats. She was dying. She knew it with a detached certainty. Perhaps this was the final act of her tragedy. Perhaps this was the justice she deserved. It was the horse that saved her. The intelligent animal, its rider slumped and unresponsive, followed its instincts. It smelled water. It followed a barely there game trail that led, eventually, to a small, isolated trading post, a collection of sod buildings huddled around a muddy spring. She must have fallen from the horse, because the next thing she knew, she was looking up at a leathery, wrinkled face with kind, dark eyes. It was an old Apache woman, the proprietor of the trading post. The woman, whose name was Running Fawn, saw the knife, the blood, and the fever in Lena's eyes, and without a word, she and her son carried the unconscious young woman into their home. For days, Lena hovered in the gray world between life and death. Running Fawn, with a knowledge of healing passed down through generations, tended to her. She carefully removed the knife, cleaned the wound with boiled herbs, and packed it with a poultice of chewed roots. She forced a bitter, fever-reducing tea between Lena's cracked lips. During her delirium, Lena spoke. She cried out the names of her father, her brothers, and Jedediah Cain. She relived the fire, the training, the final, brutal fight. Running Fawn and her son listened to the fragmented, pain-soaked story. They had heard the whispers from the north, the legend of the woman with the hatchet. Now, they knew the truth behind the myth. When the fever finally broke, Lena awoke to find herself lying on a clean pallet, her shoulder tightly bound in fresh bandages. The pain was still there, but it was a dull, clean ache, not the raging fire it had been. Running Fawn was sitting in a chair nearby, weaving a basket. "You were close to the spirit world," the old woman said, not looking up from her work. Her voice was soft, like the rustle of dry leaves. "You saved me," Lena whispered, her throat raw. "Why?" Running Fawn finally looked at her, her dark eyes holding a deep, ancient wisdom. "I did not see a killer," she said. "I saw a great wound. In your shoulder, and in your heart. The wound in your shoulder will heal. The one in your heart, that is a longer road." Lena stayed at the trading post for 3 weeks, slowly regaining her strength. In the quiet, peaceful rhythm of life at the post, away from the violence and the hate, she began to heal in more ways than one. She helped Running Fawn with her chores, her hands, so long accustomed to the weight of a weapon, relearning the simple, honest work of grinding corn and mending clothes. She learned that the story of the shootout in Serenity Flats had become a sensation. A passing patrol of soldiers had found the grievously wounded Smiling Jack, who had told them a wild, unbelievable tale of a vengeful farm girl. The legend of Lena Caldwell was now known throughout the territory. She was a folk hero to some, a blood-crazed killer to others. One day, a U.S. Marshal, following the trail of whispers, arrived at the post. He was a young man, with a square jaw and serious, intelligent eyes. He was looking for a woman who matched Lena's description. Running Fawn met him on the porch. "There is no killer here, lawman," she said, her voice firm. "There is only a young woman with a great sorrow, who is healing from a grievous wound. The men she fought are dead. The debt is paid. The story is over. Let her find her peace." The marshal looked at the old Apache woman, then past her, into the dim interior of the sod house, where he could just make out the shape of Lena, sitting by the fire. He saw not a hardened outlaw, but a wounded soul. He held her gaze for a long moment, a silent understanding passing between them. He had heard the full story of Jedediah Cain, of the corruption and the cruelty. He knew this was not a simple case of murder. It was a tragedy. With a slow nod, he turned, mounted his horse, and rode away. He would report back that the trail had gone cold, that the infamous Lena Caldwell had likely died of her wounds in the desert. He was giving her a chance, an opportunity to leave the past behind. The long road out of the hell she had created for herself was finally clear. The law had, in its own way, offered her a pardon. The question now was whether she could ever pardon herself. The marshal's quiet act of grace was a gift Lena had never expected. The official closing of her case, the declaration that she was presumed dead, meant that the ghost she had become could finally be laid to rest. She was free. But as she stood on the porch of the trading post, watching the dust from the marshal's horse settle, the freedom felt less like a release and more like a heavy and familiar burden. For 5 years, her entire identity, her every waking thought, had been defined by a single, burning purpose. Without the hatred, without the hunt, who was she? She stayed with Running Fawn for another month, her body healing completely, but her spirit still a landscape of scars. She learned much from the old woman's quiet wisdom. They rarely spoke of the past, but Running Fawn taught her about the balance of things of life and death, of grief and renewal. You cannot change the stones that are in the river, the old woman told her one evening, as they watched the sunset paint the mountains in hues of purple and gold. But you can choose how you walk around them. You have carried the stone of vengeance for a long time. Now, you must learn to set it down. Lena knew she was right. She also knew she could not stay at the trading post forever. It was a sanctuary, a place of healing, but it was not her life. One morning, she saddled the black gelding, Jedediah Kane's horse, the last physical relic of her bloody quest. She had patched her clothes, and her father's hatchet was now wrapped in leather and tucked deep into her saddlebag. It was a part of her story, a part of her pain, but she swore an oath to herself that it would never again be used in anger. She thanked Running Fawn, a debt she knew she could never truly repay. The old woman simply placed a hand on her cheek. "Walk in beauty, little sister," she said. "The path ahead is yours to make." Lena rode away with no destination in mind. She was no longer running from the law or hunting a man. She was simply adrift. She rode for weeks, through territories she had never seen, taking odd jobs on ranches, working as a cook for a cattle drive, always quiet, always keeping to herself. She was searching for a place where the ghosts of her past were quiet enough that she could hear her own thoughts. She found it, unexpectedly, in a small, green valley in the Oregon Territory. It reminded her, painfully at first, of Willow Creek. But the mountains were different, the trees were taller, and the air had the clean, sharp scent of pine and the distant sea. There was a small, struggling settlement in the valley, a town called Haven, populated by hard-working families who, like her own, were trying to build a life from the soil. She bought a small, neglected piece of land on the edge of town with the last of the money she had. It had a dilapidated cabin and a fallow field. And for the first time in years, she began to build something instead of tearing it down. The work was hard, punishing. She repaired the cabin, cleared the field, her hands growing calloused from the plow and the axe. And in the simple, honest labor of creation, she began to find a semblance of peace. The physical exhaustion helped to quiet the ghosts at night. She was still a solitary figure, known in town as the quiet woman from the South. The people of Haven were decent folk. They respected her privacy, sensing a deep sorrow in her that they did not pry into. But slowly, tentatively, she began to become a part of the community. She traded her surplus vegetables at the general store. She helped a neighbor raise a barn after a winter storm. She found that the hands that had been trained to kill could also be used to heal, to build, to help. She had not forgotten her past. She never would. The scars on her heart were as real as the one on her shoulder. There were still nights when she would wake from a dream of fire and blood, her hands clenched. But the nightmares were becoming less frequent. The faces of her family, which had once been cold, demanding specters of vengeance, were now beginning to appear in her memory as they had been in life, smiling, laughing, full of love. She was starting to remember not just how they died, but how they had lived. One spring evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sunset, the local schoolteacher, a young man named Samuel, stopped by on his way home. He was kind, and he often brought her books to read. They would talk sometimes, simple conversations about the weather, the crops, the stories in the books. He knew nothing of her past. He just saw a strong, quiet woman with sad, beautiful eyes. "It's a fine evening, Lena," he said, leaning on the porch rail. "Yes, it is," she replied, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. It was not a grand romance, not the all-consuming love she had lost. It was something quieter, gentler. It was a possibility, a chance for a new beginning. She realized then that she had finally done what Running Fawn had advised. She had set down the stone. Vengeance had given her a reason to survive, but it had not given her a reason to live. That, she was discovering, was a much harder and much more rewarding journey. The legend of the woman with the hatchet would forever belong to the blood-soaked dust of the territories, a myth whispered around distant campfires. But here, in this quiet valley, under a peaceful sky, was Lena Caldwell, a survivor, a builder, a woman who had walked through the deepest darkness and had, against all odds, found her way back into the light. The weight of the dead had finally been replaced by the precious, hopeful weight of the living.